Welcome to the digital learning on The Man in Asbestos by Stephen Butler Leacock. This is a video made for session 3 on this short story. I am Prasanna Urpikar, Associate Professor in English. The Man in Asbestos is a short story written by Stephen Butler Leacock, prescribed for the general English students of third semester BCom studying under Bengaluru City University, Bengaluru. There are totally 7 videos on this first lesson, and this is the third video for session 3. Let's have a look at the highlights of this video. The conversation between the narrator and the man in asbestos continues. Both the narrator and the man in asbestos sit on a bench. The narrator is shocked to know life had come to standstill. No communication, transportation took place. There was no work to be done. Machinery killed work. Great conquest of nature, the final victory of man and machinery. Chemical food came into existence, leading to stagnation of agriculture. No death except fear of being broken. Learning objectives of this session: to sensitize the importance of work and joyfulness in life, to get the student acquainted with the style of the short story, to understand the story and grasp its meaning, to correlate the idea in the story with their life experiences, enjoy the charm and beauty of life with all its challenges and strife. Session outcome. The outcome of this session would be sensitizing the students to the life in millennium, recapturing the era of the great conquest of nature, acquiring human values and worldview, work and joyfulness in life. Now the recap. So far in video 1 and video 2, made for session 1 and session 2, we have studied the narrator takes a trip to futurist world in his dream. The narrator meets the man in asbestos who introduces him to the millennium world. The conversation between the narrator and the man in asbestos continues. The narrator is shocked. He wonders whether was this the era of the conquest that he had hoped to see. He had always taken for granted that he did not know why that humanity was destined to move forward. This picture of what seemed desolation on the ruins of our civilization rendered the narrator almost speechless. There were little benches placed here and there on the street. Both of them sat down on the bench. The man in asbestos proudly asked the narrator, "Hasn't it improved?" The narrator gasped out a question. "Where are the street cars and the motors?" The man in asbestos said very casually, "Oh, we have done away with it long ago." How awful they must have been, the noise of them. So the man in asbestos, while talking this, rustled with shudder. The narrator was again shocked. He asked, "Without the vehicles, how do you get about? How do you move around?" The man in asbestos said, "We don't move around. Why should we? It's just the same being here as being anywhere else. We don't go anywhere." He looked at the narrator with an infinity of dreariness in his face. 1,000 questions surged into the narrator's mind at once. He asked one of the simplest questions to the man in asbestos. He asked, "But how do you get back and forwards to your work?" The man in asbestos said, "Work? There isn't any work. It's all finished. The last of the work was all done centuries ago. Now we are not left with any work." When the man in asbestos told the narrator that there was absolutely no work, the narrator looked at him a moment open-mouthed. Then the narrator turned and looked again at the grey desolation of the street with the asbestos figures moving here and there. The narrator tried to pull his senses together. He realized that if he was to unravel this new and undreamed of future, he must go at it systematically and step by step. The narrator, after a pause, asked, "Momentous things have happened since my time. I wish you would let me ask you about it all systematically and would explain it to me bit by bit. So, first, tell me, what do you mean by saying that there is no work?" The man in asbestos answered in a very strange acquaintance. "Why, it died out of itself. Machinery killed the work. If I remember rightly, you had a certain amount of machinery even in your time. You had done very well with steam, made a good beginning with electricity, though I think radial energy had hardly as yet been put to use." The narrator nodded assent. He nodded positively. Then the man in asbestos continued, "But you found it, did you no good? The better your machines, the harder you worked. The more things you had, the more you wanted. The pace of life grew swifter and swifter. You cried out, but it would not stop. You were all caught in the cogs of your own machine. None of you could see the end." The narrator said, "That's quite true. But how do you know it all?" "Oh," answered the man in asbestos, "that part of my education was very well operated." "Ah, I see you do not know what I mean. Never mind, I can tell you that later. Well, then there came, probably almost 200 years after your time, the era of the great conquest of nature, the final victory of man and machinery. Great conquest of nature refers to man's victory on nature. Machines came one after the other. So now the narrator asked the man in asbestos, with a thrill of old hope in his voice. He asked, "Did they really conquer nature?" The man in asbestos very confidently answers, "Yes, conquered it, beat it out, fought it to a standstill. Things came one by one, then faster and faster. In 100 years, it was all done. In fact, just as soon as mankind turned its energy to decreasing its needs instead of increasing its desires, the whole thing was easy. Chemical food came first. Heavens, the simplicity of it. And in your time, thousands of millions of people tilled and grubbed at the soil from morning till night. I have seen specimens of them, farmers they call them. There's one in the museum. After the invention of chemical food, we piled up enough in the emporiums in a year to last for centuries. Agriculture went overboard. Eating and all that goes with it, domestic labor, housework, everything ended, came to a standstill. Nowadays, one takes a concentrated pill every year or so, that's all. The whole digestive apparatus, as you knew it, was a clumsy thing that had been bloated up like a set of bagpipes to the evolution of its use. So, agriculture stopped, eating, domestic labor, housework, everything came to an end. So today, what they do is, they just take one pill a year and they never feel hungry at all. So hunger is also defeated. The man in asbestos continued his explanation. He said, chemical food came first. That cut off almost 1/3 of the work. And then came asbestos clothes. That was wonderful. In 1 year, humanity made enough suits to last for ever and ever. That, of course, could never have been if it hadn't been connected with the revolt of women and the fall of fashion. The narrator was again shocked. He asked, have the fashions gone then? So there isn't that decorative dresses? The narrator looked around and his eyes rested on the moving figures in asbestos. Yes, all of the people there were in asbestos clothes. The man in asbestos replies, yes, no fashion, everything has gone. The next to that we killed, or practically killed, the changes of climate. I don't think that in your day you properly understood how much of your work was due to the shifts of what you called the weather. It meant the need of all kinds of special clothes and houses and shelters, a wilderness of work. How dreadful it must have been in your day. Wind and storms, great wet masses. What did you call them? Clouds flying through the air. The ocean full of salt, was it not? Tossed and torn by the wind, snow thrown all over everything. Rains, how awful. The narrator said, sometimes it was very beautiful. And how did you alter it? Killed the weather, answered the man in asbestos. Simple as anything. We simply turned its forces loose one against the other, altered the composition of the sea so that the top became all more or less gelatinous. I really can't explain it, as it is an operation that I never took at school. But it made the sky grey as you see it, and the sea gum-colored, the weather all the same. It cut out fuel and houses and an infinity of work with them. He paused for a moment. The narrator began to realize something of the course of evolution that had happened. The man in asbestos paused a moment. The narrator asked, "Then the conquest of nature meant that presently there was no more work to do?" "Exactly," said the man in asbestos. "No work is left. Nothing is left." "Is there enough food for all?" asked the narrator. "Yes," said the man in asbestos, "enough of food. We take just one pill a year. We consume chemical food, which is already manufactured and stored." "What about houses and clothes?" The man in asbestos, waving his hand, said, "There they are. Go out and take them. Of course, they are falling down, slowly, very slowly, but they will last for centuries yet. Nobody need bother." It was then the narrator realized. He thought for the first time just that what work had meant in the old life, and how much of the texture of life itself had been bound up in the keen effort of it. The narrator looked upward. He saw the dangling remains of telephone wires. Pointing at them, he asked the man in asbestos, "What became of all that? The telegraph and the telephone and all the system of communication?" "Ha," said the man in asbestos. "That was what a telephone meant for. I knew that it had been suppressed centuries ago. What did you use for those telephones?" The narrator answered with an enthusiasm. "By means of telephone, we could talk to anybody. We could call up anybody and talk at any distance." The man in asbestos said, "What a dreadful age was yours. No, we don't have any telephones. All the transportation and intercommunication is forbidden. There is no sense in it." He added, "What you don't realize is that people after your day became gradually more and more reasonable. They took the railroad. It brought into every town a lot of people from every other town. But when work itself was stopped, commerce ended, and food was needless. The weather was killed. It was foolish to move about, so it was all terminated. So we don't have any telephone, telegraphs, or transportation, or even intercommunication. Everything is forbidden. When there is no work, when there is no commerce, and when we have food as much as we want, when the weather is killed, there is no need to keep any communication alive." So the man in asbestos, after telling that all sorts of communications, intercommunications, and transportations have been terminated, he gave a quick look of apprehension, and with a change in his voice, he said, "It was dangerous." The narrator was surprised. He asked, "Do you have any danger? Was transportation dangerous for you?" The man in asbestos said, Yes, there was always the danger of getting broken. The narrator did not understand. He asked, "What does that mean?" The man in asbestos explained, "I suppose that is what you call being dead. Of course, in one sense. There has been no death for centuries past. We cut that out. Disease and death were simply a matter of germs. We found them one by one. I think that even in your day, you had found one or two of the easier, the bigger ones." The narrator nodded. The man in asbestos continued, "Yes, you had found diphtheria and typhoid. And if I'm right, there were some outstanding, like scarlet fever and smallpox, that you called ultra-microscopic and which you were still hunting for, and others that you didn't even suspect. Well, we hunted them down one by one and destroyed them. Strange that it never occurred to any of you that old age was only a germ. It turned out to be quite a simple one, but it was so distributed in its action that you never even thought of it." In amazement, the narrator asked, "No death, does that mean you live forever nowadays?" The man in asbestos said, "Yes, we live forever, unless, of course, we get broken. That happens sometimes. I mean that we may fall over a high place or bump on something and snap ourselves. You see, we are just a little brittle still, some remnant, I suppose, of the old age germ, and we have to be careful, in fact." He continued, "I don't mind saying that accidents of this sort were the most distressing feature of our civilization till we took steps to cut out all accidents. We forbid all streetcars, street traffic, aeroplanes, and so on. The risks of your time," he said, with a shiver of his asbestos clothes, "must have been awful." The narrator said, "They were, with a new kind of pride in my generation that I had never felt before." The narrator says, he said, "We thought it part of the duty of brave people too." The summary of this session. The conversation between the narrator and the man in asbestos continues. The narrator was shocked to know life had come to standstill. There was no work to be done. Machinery killed work. Great conquest of nature was established. The final victory of man and machinery had taken place. Chemical food came into existence, leading to stagnation of agriculture. No death except fear of being broken existed. Thank you, students. Thank you for listening to this video.